Hello and welcome to Popular Antiquarian, the podcast about a middle-aged man exploring the strange and forgotten corners of pop culture. That middle-aged man is me, Hieronymus J. Doom, and this episode is another in our long-running series looking at the films of the Asylum, a mockbuster-focused, low-budget studio that is often considered the worst film studio in the world. This episode we're watching Titanic 666, the 2022 sequel to Titanic 2, their cheeky movie about a ship called Titanic 2 that was definitely meant to confuse people into thinking it was a legitimate sequel to James Cameron's box office shattering Titanic movie. It was able to do this because you can't copyright actual historical events. Before we get into the serious business of the episode, don't forget that this show is entirely funded by my supporters over on patreon.com/HJDoom. It is thanks to their generosity that this show is on the air and ad-free for all. Every supporter receives a bevy of gaming goodness written by members of the Doom household, as well as the warm glow of helping to keep my body and soul together in these parlous times. All support at whatever level is gratefully received. Supporters also sometimes get to pick what I cover, and this is an example of that, with Titanic 666 beating off challenges from such classics as Transmorphers, Fall of Man, and Giant Shark vs. Crocosaurus. I don't want to reopen old wounds, but Titanic 2 was not a good movie. It had the singular accolade of being the single worst looking Asylum movie we've covered so far, to the extent that the titular cruise ship was largely being played by the inside of an office building. An office building they clearly did not have permission to get wet. Doing a maritime disaster movie without any water is quite the ambitious challenge, and Titanic 2 failed spectacularly. It's in the running for the worst Asylum film I've covered so far, but at least it was so incompetent on every conceivable level that it was kind of a fun watch. It's fair to say that my expectations for a sequel to Titanic 2 were rock bottom. When I started watching Titanic 666, I was a little bit surprised. The action opens on the sinking of the original Titanic. A woman in a floaty dress struggles across the deck. She's trying to get to the lifeboats amid the chaos and find her husband. We cut to a man clinging to a rail suspended over the churning dark waters. He loses his grip and plunges into the icy water with a scream. The unnamed woman too is sent falling into the sea as the Titanic enters its death throes. She manages to make it to an upturned boat and drifts alone on a lonely sea as the vast bulk of the Titanic finally slips beneath the waves behind her. She calls for her lover, her voice the only sound amid the aftermath of the disaster. She hears a small sound, sees a small movement in the water, and then screams as a hideous zombie creature comes rearing out of the darkness to drag her down to an icy grave. Cue opening credits. Several things struck me simultaneously in these opening moments. The first was that they had actually got a set that resembled the deck of an actual vessel. The second was that there were enough extras to make the frame look faintly crowded. The third was that people were falling into actual water. The fourth was that the digital model of the Titanic didn't look as though it was done by a drunk in MS Paint. This looked like an actual film, not some near-suicidal actors pretending to be menaced by an iceberg in a conference centre. What on earth was going on? The answer is that Titanic 666 was made in partnership with the streaming platform Tubi, putting this in a similar category to the films that the Asylum have made in partnership with the Sci-Fi Channel. Rather than the budget being a carrier bag full of greasy $5 bills, this means that the budget for Titanic 666 is more representative of the very low end of what you would expect from a TV movie. Tubi are absolutely happy to churn out lowest common denominator trash, but like the Sci-Fi Channel, they do actually require that the end product not resemble a weirdly well-lit student film project. This means that Titanic 666 would look like absolute shit if you were to see it on the big screen, but looks fine compared to other Asylum fare if, like me, you're watching it on a medium-sized tablet you inherited from your sister. Titanic 666 was clearly at least partially shot aboard an actual ship, which is extremely good for helping the viewer believe that the film is taking place aboard, a ship, rather than on an industrial estate in Croydon or inside a chain pub. They've been down to the engine room and everything. It's got pipes all over the shop. I don't know much about boats, but I do know that the more pipes you have, the more I believe you're on an actual boat. That's just basic engineering. I haven't used Tubi before, but I think there's at least someone on the team who's on my kind of drugs, because among the movies it recommended I watch were such classics as A Very British Christmas, Popeye the Slayer Man, and what looks like a direct-to-video origin story for the Tin Man from the Oz books. These are, in a sense, my kind of people. I'd love to get inside the mind of a man, and it will definitely have been a man at Tubi, who thought that a good use of their budget was a horror movie sequel to a near unwatchable disaster movie from 12 years earlier that was pretending to be a sequel to a different film. Films, even Asylum films, cost a lot of money to make when compared to literally any other form of entertainment, and I find it delightful that somehow the economics of global distribution means that something like this is a good idea. In many ways, Titanic 666 is the movie Titanic 2 should have been in the first place. While the idea of some lunatic building a replica Titanic and driving it into the nearest iceberg is on the face of it pleasantly stupid, it's also something I can imagine Elon Musk doing, which robs it of quite a lot of the escapist fantasy component. The one thing Elon Musk can't do, at least at the time of recording, is fill a replica of the Titanic with ghosts before driving it into the nearest iceberg. That's the kind of next level stupid that actually works better than the less stupid iteration of the idea, and it helps that I think Titanic 666 very nearly pulls it off. I don't want to get carried away with this. I was extremely pleasantly surprised by Titanic 666, but that's as much to do with just how incompetent Titanic 2 really was. If your first colonoscopy involved a woman on PCP trying to jam the machine all the way up inside you, back to front, then the second colonoscopy, where the doctor was merely a couple of cocktails down, is going to get rave reviews by comparison. But that doesn't mean that you'd go to your friends and bang on about how they've got to check out the local colonoscopy clinic. Titanic 666 is still a bad movie by most sane standards. The problem is that my brain is badly broken and my expectations were so abysmally low that you'd need one of James Cameron's fancy submersibles to actually go and look at them. So I had a really nice time with Titanic 666, and I don't mind admitting it. But then I am predispositioned towards liking extremely dumb horror movies. From the opening sequence we get a faintly arresting title sequence showing various bits of ephemera from the Titanic lazily descending into the nightless depths alongside the doomed vessel itself. It's evocative, and there's actually some relevance to the overall plot, which is a rare thing indeed for an Asylum movie title sequence. Now, this is very much a 3-act structure of a movie, with the first act introducing us to the characters and the inciting incident, the second act revealing the reason for the inciting incident, and the third act being everything going extremely badly wrong for everyone. Once you get past Act 1, there's plenty of weird stuff and dead bodies to keep things interesting, and it does build to an eventual payoff that the budget can't quite deliver on, but which is still kind of interesting. What we have is a ship. Unbelievably, another exact replica of the Titanic called Titanic 3, which is about to do its maiden voyage along the exact same route as the original Titanic because, of course it is. I don't want to hear any talk of curses or the fact that the Las Vegas gambling companies are offering odds on the ship making it home in one piece, says the captain, who is played with efficiency by experienced jobbing character actor Keesha Sharp. And it's nice to see them lampshading the fact that we all know this is not going to make it, and indeed, no one in this fictional world is going to be particularly surprised when it goes down with all hands. Meanwhile, a mysterious young woman pulls herself out of a bag stowed in the baggage hold and immediately starts doing a weird ritual. It's really not clear why she stowed away on board the ship rather than simply buying a ticket, but hey, it's a nice image, someone clambering out of a bag. The stowaway is played by Lydia Hurst, who is a great-granddaughter of William Randolph Hearst, on whom Orson Welles' Citizen Kane was based. She's also the daughter of Patty Hearst, famous both as an actor and for her abduction by the Symbionese Liberation Army and her subsequent involvement in some of their crimes in traumatic and psychologically complex circumstances. Lydia Hurst is something of a horror specialist, having appeared in numerous horror movies over the years, and she gives this performance her absolute all, delivering viewers a quality weird girl who veers somewhere between misplaced idealism and rabid insanity. The other important character introduced in this opening portion of the narrative is Professor Cochrane, who has a large collection of Titanic memorabilia which is on display for the passengers, and also, and this is something Cochrane is at pains to stress, available for purchase for anyone well-heeled enough. He's played by another jobbing actor, Jamie Bamber, who nerds may remember from the early 2000s Battlestar Galactica remake. Here he's allowed to do his native British accent and also delivers probably the standout performance in that he's playing an absolute piece of shit and doesn't make any effort to soften the character's rough edges. Not only is he only on board to try and flog the personal effects of the victims of a disaster, he's also rude, insensitive, creepy, grasping, and a tremendous physical coward. He's a weird choice for the default protagonist, but it does sort of work. It's Professor Cochrane who is the instigating factor for the doom that hangs over Titanic 3. The mysterious young woman has snuck on board to take magical revenge on the ship for desecrating the remains of those who died, in particular her own great-grandfather, who was the captain of the Titanic and went down with the ship. It's not clear why or how Lydia Hurst chooses to take her revenge by smuggling herself on board the Titanic and then doing a magic ritual to summon the ghosts of the drowned to take revenge, but honestly, it doesn't matter. The performances make it clear she's got a few screws loosed, and sometimes that's all you actually need. It is notable that all three of these key roles are filled by professional actors with lengthy and successful careers in their various niches. These are all people not only with IMDb pages, but with actual headshots on their IMDb pages. And indeed, the vast majority of the cast here has an IMDb page with a headshot attached. Everyone is doing proper acting in this as well. There is no sign of a faintly well-known but physically spent character actor sat behind a desk in a handful of scenes. Everyone here is standing up and appearing in multiple sets. Alongside these three key roles, we get introduced to a host of supporting characters, including a head of security who looks like a partially deflated testicle, a husband and wife influencer team who are excruciatingly grating and constantly filming everything they do, several junior members of the crew whose uniforms don't really fit, and a slightly gauche and uber-enthusiastic woman who is a big fan of Mr. and Mrs. Influencer. These are all stock characters to an extent, but they're all well defined enough that I can remember who they are without having to look at the notes on my phone, which is a better level of characterisation than usual. Lydia Hurst's ritual in the basement seems to take forever, most of the first 30 minutes of the film, and when she's not chanting and shouting in the dark, the rest of the cast are establishing the B-plot, which is simply that Professor Cochrane is a massive tool. When Mr. and Mrs. Influencer accidentally bump into him while filming, he tears a strip off them about how rude they are and about how morally bankrupt their lifestyle is, which is ironic of course considering he's a literal grave robber. Later, to emphasise his total lack of moral fibre, he will have a big change of heart when he realises that they are really wealthy, and thus ideal people to try and sell dead people's stuff to. He's also extremely rude to Lydia Hurst when she briefly goes upstairs to fondle some of the loot he's got on display. If you've ever worked in customer service, even briefly, I guarantee you have met this guy, and he's the reason you dream about punching members of the public, even, in my case, best part of 20 years later. Pretty much bang on the half-hour mark, things kick into something resembling high gear. The ritual is done, and the Titanic's original captain appears as a spooky ghost man. It's now time to get on with their spooky revenge on the passengers and crew of the Titanic 3. This is essentially done as a low-key slasher movie, with various characters getting bumped off by vengeful ghosts. These are staged fairly simply, but using the kind of techniques that are always effective. The ghost of the man who played Nearer My God Than Thee as the Titanic sank on his violin is possibly my favourite as he appears, plays music that starts mournful and then goes hideously atonal before slicing his bow viciously across the strings of his violin and causing Mrs. Influencer to collapse as though her throat has been cut. It's very eerie, and even though it's totally bloodless, it hits much harder than, for instance, the engineer who gets decapitated by a flying vent cap in the engine room. Or maybe it's just that I've seen so many decapitations in Asylum movies. They love a decapitation. It's something their VFX team seem to have mastered doing quite well with CGI, and that means they do it a lot. Surrounding the ghosts, there's a lot of weird fog, and also that curious effect that seems to have crept in around the turn of the century, where weird movement is conveyed by a series of extremely short shots from slightly different angles that turns the approaching ghost into a staccato and frenetic series of almost static shots, with some of the shots sped up or slowed down to try and make the movement appear even stranger. It always seems very mid-2000s to me as a technique. It reminds me of films like Saw and the remake of 13 Ghosts. Also, the ghosts quite often kill people or do spooky stuff to them by breathing freezing air onto them, which is appropriately unsettling the first time it happens, but does get old once you realise it's a very cheap effect that they're using to avoid having to stage anything more complicated. While the ghosts are causing chaos initially at the fringes, Professor Cochrane is being fingered for the deaths of Mr. and Mrs. Influencer. This allows the film to do a sequence where he's locked in the brig with the head of security, who is revealed to be in cahoots with Professor Cochrane for very unclear reasons. He's doing something to facilitate Cochrane flogging Titanic souvenirs to the wealthy, but it's wildly unclear what that is or why the head of security would be especially useful in this endeavour. Cochrane is then left alone in the room for a bit, and some spooky stuff happens to him. He gets tied to the bunks and then equally mysteriously released. Gradually it begins to dawn on the crew that there's something very badly wrong with the ship. There's been a big explosion in the engine room, half the crew seems to have vanished, which is convenient at this budget, and there's a fair number of deaths to deal with. Plus, the fancy systems that run the boat seem to be badly on the fritz. The gradual awareness that things are going awry in a spooky way forms the second act, and the third act essentially just amps up the pressure and the bad stuff as Titanic 3 lurches towards the same fate as Titanic's 1 and 2, with the added frisson that there's a malevolent will guiding this latest doomed vessel to the date with destiny. The engine that really powers the third act is the reveal that Lydia Hurst is behind it all. She's been fairly sidelined in the first two acts, doing her own thing, only occasionally interacting with the rest of the cast. Once she's revealed herself, she gets to do a low-key pantomime villain thing, which is honestly very enjoyable. The script has worked out that her rationale for dooming 1,000 people to a watery grave is paper thin. Okay, so her great-grandfather was Edward Smith, the captain of the Titanic, and she's incensed that Professor Cochrane has disturbed the rest of those who died, and worse, seeks to profit from it. That's a fine motivation for, I don't know, a series of pointed letters to a major newspaper, but probably not sufficient motivation for an atrocity. Fortunately, being completely insane is always sufficient motivation for an atrocity in the movies, and we get some entertainingly demented grandstanding from Hurst as she clashes with the captain and surviving crew on the bridge of the ship. She does some more magic, a few more people get offed, the ship gets set on a collision course with the nearest large iceberg, that sort of thing. The captain attempts to reason with her, pointing out that Lydia Hurst's approach to justice is demented and that surely her ancestor wouldn't want her to die with everyone else, all of which are fair points. They've kind of written themselves into a corner which they get out of by just having Lydia Hurst do an evil cackle and cut her own throat, which magically amps up the carnage even further. She is great in this latter portion of the film, leaning into the fact that her character lacks motivation to deliver a wicked stepmother panto performance I found very arresting. The other element of the third act is a little arc where Professor Cochrane stops being the worst person in the world and helps a few people into the lifeboats like a genuine humanitarian. He's been confronted by Lydia Hurst, who tells him that his punishment will be to watch everyone else on the Titanic 3 die before dying himself. This is basically warning the viewer that the tow rag in chief, being probably the most famous actor in the production, is going to be with us to the bitter end. We get to see him cowering in a doorway as a ghost forces his security sidekick into blowing his own brains out, which makes appropriately little mess considering how dim that character was. He briefly experiments with trying to give the Titanic swag back, but swiftly works out that's probably not going to help. Finally, after a stern talking to from the captain, he does the bare minimum you'd want someone to do during a maritime disaster by helping a few women and children to the lifeboats. Is this enough to redeem his sullied soul? Thankfully, the narrative more or less decides it isn't, though they do feel it's a close-run thing, which it totally isn't. He dies in a lifeboat with the captain before coming back as a zombie ghost to finish her off as well, which is a bit harsh, honestly, given that she's the most competent person in the entire film and did more or less nothing wrong. The sinking itself is fascinating in the sense that we've got some borderline adequate CGI of the ship hitting the iceberg and sinking beneath the waves, and the production has access to a large enough body of water to be able to stage people falling in. It's entirely possible that this is still basically just a swimming pool, but unlike Titanic 2, it doesn't visibly read as a swimming pool, so it's fine. There are a couple of shots of large amounts of water surging through the ship. They're very short and I think composited together in post-production rather than involving flooding actual sets with large amounts of water. The rest of the sinking is mostly conveyed through people panicking while the camera shakes or shoots them from weird angles. The set they've rigged up to be the deck is clearly quite small and apparently only filmable from certain angles, but it does the job, and at least there's some water being sprayed about to give the illusion of a small degree of veracity. Judging by the standards of a normal film, this is bare bones, and doubtless many viewers unfamiliar with that Asylum house style will have found the denouement of the film to be underwhelming and unconvincing in equal parts, but for those of us who swim in the murky waters of the Asylum, this is something of a revelation. Compared to Titanic 2's abysmal efforts to depict a sinking cruise liner, Titanic 666's sinking looks like Titanic. Overall, I think this is a surprisingly good film. The cast is stronger than anything we've seen so far, and the direction finds time for a small amount of visual flair along the way. The director, Nick Lyons, is an Asylum staple, and this was, I think, at least his 8th film for the studio. It is also currently his last. Maybe he just felt his career had peaked. His other credits include various TV movies for the Sci-Fi Channel and others, and an action movie starring Danny Trejo in that weird period where every week there seemed to be another action movie starring an increasingly geriatric Danny Trejo. He's clearly the very safest pair of hands for this kind of nonsense, and he knows how to get the most out of a quick and dirty shooting schedule. With the action scenes in particular, he's managed to make them fractionally less blink and you'll miss them than usual, something helped by the ghost makeup being good enough to pass muster for anything up to 5 seconds at a time. The biggest weakness of the film is that the ostensible main character is such an unlikable scumbag. While watching him suffer is quite entertaining, the film doesn't commit to its sadistic treatment of him and makes this very half-hearted effort to rehabilitate him in the final act. Now, I don't have a problem with anti-heroes. I'm a huge fan of the Flashman series, but you need to have some idea of what you're going to do with them, and Titanic 666 can't quite make up its mind whether to give you the catharsis of a terrible person being put through the ringer or the uplifting narrative of a terrible person learning how to be better when everything is on the line. Both approaches are perfectly reasonable, but I think they did need to pick one. Fortunately, this is essentially an ensemble piece, and that means that Cochrane isn't in every scene. He doesn't wear out his welcome, and he doesn't become a huge problem for the narrative, I don't think. Now, Keesha Sharp as the captain could possibly have been made into the protagonist. She's depicted with a degree of warmth and shows a level of competence that's broadly unique in the film. She's somewhat underwritten, which is a shame, but I did like that there's this nice middle-aged lady who knows how things work, trying to make sense of it all and making broadly good decisions, even though it's clear none of those good decisions are going to change things a jot. So, Titanic 666 is absolutely my kind of lunatic concept, and as I said earlier, it's a shame this wasn't actually Titanic 2 because it would have made Titanic 2 into a much more enjoyable movie. It's also a pity that they went with Titanic 666 as a title instead of Titanic 3. I get why they did that. You absolutely want to signal that this is a horror movie in your marketing because horror fans, and I speak with love here, are idiots. Equally, you probably don't want a bunch of mums tuning in for Titanic 3 expecting a tragic romance and then seeing people getting their heads ripped off. I do feel as though it was a missed opportunity to make Titanic 666 imply that there had been 665 previous Titanics and no one had learned anything, and they're just continually building the largest ship ever and sailing it off to sink without trace. That would have been fun, but yeah, I'm guessing this changed titles at some point during the production. Now, I was, of course, primed to enjoy Titanic 666 because I am very much a horror idiot at heart, but I was pleasantly surprised that the sequel no one asked for was as much fun as it was. It's been really interesting to see what happens with this movie if you give the Asylum fractionally more money than usual, and pleasing to realise that it does seem as though it all still ends up on screen. It's also funny reading the negative reviews on IMDb laying into the special effects, because my instant reaction to people saying, "This looks like it was made on TikTok, I've never seen worse special effects in my life," is to go, "You sweet, innocent children, my precious, sheltered babies, you think this is bad special effects? Come with me, my treasures, I have such sights to show you." That is all for this episode. Next time we're going to be looking at something that's really set up to fail on an Asylum budget: epic fantasy. 2006's Dragon looks like a real stinker, and I genuinely can't even begin to fathom how you'd go about making a movie about dragons for $500,000. Join me in a couple of weeks and we'll find out together. In the meantime, if you want to get in touch with me, you can do so by email at hjdoomretrofun, or one word, @gmail.com, or by following me on Blue Sky at hjdoom. If you're having fun with this podcast, why not leave a rating or a review? That will help other people find it as well. Thank you very much for listening. Take care, and I'll see you soon.